are still some around him who want him to stay above the fray on Trump and to stay above the fray on Trump's totalitarianism and to stay above the fray on Trump morphing into Hitler and especially to stay above the new fray on Trump and the 14th Amendment and your newest Hallmark movie, A Trumpy Christmas at the Supreme Court. But frankly, President Biden is at his best, when he is the spokesman for a nation dedicated to using all legal means to save this country from more Trump. Biden is not merely the president. He has a natural, perfect pitch touch, blending matter-of-factness and the collective anger of 200 million or more Americans. Yesterday, tarmac at Milwaukee, Air Force One roaring in the background, the back seat of the beast awaiting him. The question is shouted at him about the Colorado Supreme Court decision, and he shouts back that he cannot comment on a court case, yet you can see he's just dying to comment on it. And when the follow-up question is shouted at him, is he an insurrectionist? The president makes sure he's not yelling, and he's not drowned out, and he ambles over to the reporter, and he lets her ask it again, and then Joe Biden burns Donald J. Trump to the ground with one casually flicked away match.
Is Trump an insurrectionist, sir?
Well, I think certainly it's self-evident. You saw it all. Now, whether the 14th Amendment applies, I'll let the court make that decision. But he certainly supported an insurrection. And no question about it. None. Zero. And he seems to be doubling down on about everything. Anyway.
Burned him to the ground. Because no one can remind you of the obviousness of an answer more efficiently, yet without any sense of condescension or correction, than can Joe Biden. No one. He can also throw into that mix anger or wistfulness or cynicism interwoven with humor, like a Photoshop artist blending yellows and blues to get exactly the right green for the occasion. He did it in the debates. He did it in the Philadelphia speech last year. He did it in the days before the coup attempt when he sucked all the credibility out of Secretary of State Mike Pompeo simply by repeating that. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and then giving an almost indiscernible chuckle of dismissal. More offhand dismissals, please, of anything that even hints that Trump is not the consummate human personification of evil or stupidity or hatred or cheesiness or insurrection. Do this every day, Mr. President. Plant the damn questions if you have to. The rest of us can do the railing and the yelling. You be the one who condemns with that casually flicked away match. And how the rest of us have railed. From the reaction on the right to this, especially from baby Hitler himself, you would think that nobody has ever before tried to get any candidate disqualified from the presidential ballot. You know, like baby Hitler, Trump tried to get Obama disqualified and used a fabricated, faked birth certificate to do it. Like he tried to get Ted Cruz disqualified in 2016 for being born in Canada on constitutional disqualification. I don't want to win it on technicalities, but that's more than a technicality. That is a big, big factor. Dementia J. Trump, January 12, 2016, Cedar Rapids, Iowa. As if he did not repeat over and over again during his first campaign that Hillary Clinton should not be allowed to run for the White House. Not allowed. Dementia J. Trump, October 12, 2016, Lakeland, Florida.
She shouldn't be allowed to run for president. She shouldn't be allowed. I'm telling you, she should not be allowed to run for president. Based on her crimes, she should not be allowed to run for president.
For her crimes. He based that, I believe, on the third clause of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution in his mind that only he can see. So spare me the "how dare the Democrats do this?" And oh, by the way, the case was filed by Republicans, including the former Republican majority leader in the Colorado House and Senate. And speaking of which, as Elie Mystal pointed out, if and when the Supreme Court takes the appeal, and by the way, tick, 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 you got 16 days, and now only 10 of them aren't weekends and or holidays. If the Supreme Court takes this seriously rather than letting Leonard Leo and Harlan Crow write its ruling for it, the most intriguing part of its verdict will be how it gets around that most treasured and publicized of the fascists' legal rationalizations for destroying everything, states' rights. The court has used states' rights, a Civil War term, as the excuse to curtail early voting, as a reason to shorten voting hours, as a justification for reestablishing aspects of Jim Crow voting laws, as a reason to gerrymander semi-sentient white supremacist blobs of excrement like Marjorie Taylor Greene into the House of Representatives. The Colorado ruling is at heart a states' rights case, or at least it would be if it had been filed by Republicans against a Democrat. Look, we are Colorado. We are a state. These are our state laws about elections. These are our state laws about presidential eligibility. These are our state laws requiring us to observe and act at the instruction of the Constitution of the United States. And the John Roberts answer to that is going to be what? Well, yeah, states' rights, always. Not these states' rights. As the Trump lickers circle the wagons around baby Hitler and cry due process, Mr. Mystal also notes what I have noted here before several times, that the disqualification clause of the 14th Amendment does not say convicted of insurrection. It says engaged in insurrection. Senator-elect, former Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens was not convicted, but he was disqualified. Senator-elect Vance, same thing. That would be Zebulon Vance, a Republican writer and the Confederate governor of North Carolina from 1862 to 1865. So same general disloyalty as J.D. Vance, just a different century. Oh, and remember, those amendments, they are the backbone of America. The Second Amendment, even though it does not include the word own or any synonym for own, well, it guarantees gun ownership rights forever. The 14th Amendment, because it does not include a picture of Trump along with his Social Security number, it cannot be used to disqualify him ever. A reminder also that the 14th Amendment was written largely, in fact, almost exclusively by, since they like to bring up their role in the Civil War all the time, the 14th Amendment was written almost exclusively by Republicans. More seriously, this is the Supreme Court justices' chance to redeem their souls and their court, to prove they are stewards of the intent of the framers of the original text and the amendments, and not incidentally to save the nation from a man who would destroy any part of its purpose or ethos for his own personal purposes or amusement. A man who would destroy the Supreme Court, this Supreme Court, these justices, any one of them, including the ones he appointed. Ask Bill Barr. Imagine, ultimately, the liberation of John Roberts and even Amy Coney Barrett and maybe even Gorsuch if they concurred with Colorado and Trump was no more in the American political world. And still speaking of Republicans and the 14th Amendment, it is imperative right now to revisit the story that really lit the first fire under the premise of disqualifying Trump simply by, reading the Constitution. Early last August, Will Baude, faculty director of the Constitutional Law Institute at the University of Chicago Law School, former clerk for Chief Justice Roberts, he gave the Scalia lecture at Harvard Law early this year, member of the Federalist Society, and not just that, but past winner of the Federalist Society Award for the Best Young Law Professor, the award they once gave to John Yoo, the guy who told George Bush he had the high sign to do the torture. This Professor Baude revealed that he and constitutional law professor Michael Stokes Paulson were to publish in the University of Pennsylvania Law Review during 2024 their studied, academic, dry as dust, constitutional, scholarly analysis that there was no debate about this, that there was no lawsuit required, no protests nor rallies necessary, that, quote, Donald Trump cannot be president, cannot run for president, cannot become president, cannot hold office unless 2/3 of Congress decides to grant him amnesty for his conduct on January 6th, unquote. Professor Bode said that, summarizing it for the New York Times. In that quote, though, he is almost wishy-washy compared to what he and Paulson write in the paper itself. It is unquestionably fair to say that Trump engaged in the January 6th insurrection through both his actions and his inaction. The bottom line is that Donald Trump both engaged in insurrection or rebellion and gave aid or comfort to others engaging in such conduct within the original meaning of those terms as employed in Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Professors Bode and Paulson of the Federalist Society devoted a year to studying the original meaning of it because the ultra-conservative Federalist Society, have I mentioned these guys are in the Federalist Society? The Federalist Society believes the Constitution can be interpreted only in exactly the way its authors, including the authors of the amendments, intended at the time. A year studying this. And their conclusion was not just that Trump is ineligible to be president, or to be elected president, or to run for president, but that it's automatic. It is the default position. It is true right this minute. A lawsuit shouldn't be a debate over the meaning, they say. A lawsuit should only be there as a measure to force every official who has to certify a candidate's eligibility to refuse to certify Trump because he is not eligible. I mean, listen to this quote. Section 3's disqualification rule may and must be followed, applied, honored, obeyed, enforced, carried out by anyone whose job it is to figure out whether someone is legally qualified to office. In other words, if you don't keep Trump off the ballot, you may have broken the law. As Mr. Bode said, quote, the question of should Donald Trump go to jail is entrusted to the criminal process. The question of should he be allowed to take the constitutional oath again and be given constitutional power again is not a question given to any jury, unquote. Again, this was not written by the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I mentioned Professor Bode's resume. Professor Paulson's is 35 pages long, and it indicates that apart from his primary expertise, the Constitution and the federal laws relating to the Constitution, his other areas of specialization are church and state and abortion/right to life. These men should be conservative superstars, and Bode's work, connected by clerkship to John Roberts and by recognition to Antonin Bloody Scalia, his work should actually influence this court, except for one thing. After their advocacy for the 14th Amendment and their insistence it is automatic that right now Trump is ineligible to be on the ballot in Colorado or anywhere else, after that came out last August, the fascists were silent for a day or so, and then they found it. Professor Bode had, at some point, been branded a never-Trumper. And in the world of baby Hitler and the Naziettes, that's it. That's final. He's opposed to Trump, therefore he's lying. There is no argument for disqualification. There is no applicability of the 14th Amendment. There is no 14th Amendment. In fact, Bode is a never-Trumper, therefore there is no number 14. When the Colorado Supreme Court ruled Trump ineligible because of his insurrection, a writer for the Free Beacon, which is a pretty fascist outfit, but in a minor league kind of way. A writer named Drew Holden tweeted, in case you were wondering why Dems and the media kept calling January 6th an insurrection, it was to make this possible. On January 6th, 2021, this same guy, Drew Holden, tweeted, "The President of the United States, a man of our political party, conservatives, has given cover to a collective action that can only be called insurrection." This is the way they think, or more accurately, the way they do not think. They do not even remember their world before they enslaved themselves to baby Hitler. And the loyalty requires the denial not just of all other realities, but of refusing to take the arguments of others or the arguments of themselves in the past as, sincere but mistaken. There is only obeyance. There is only servitude. They are on a mission to serve Trump and install totalitarianism on his behalf, and no logic, nor persuasion, nor law, nor what they said last week will stop them. I said it last week, and I'll say it again. This is the scene in our real-life reenactment of the film Rosemary's Baby, where Mia Farrow shakes off the drugs, then the anesthetics and the gaslighting, and she sees the devil on top of her, and she shouts, "This is no dream. This is really happening." And by the way, the Republican Party of Colorado has found a way around the state Supreme Court, and maybe the U.S. Supreme Court, and maybe the Supreme Court of the planet Skyron in the galaxy of Andromeda. Trump can't be on the Colorado primary ballot? Then we don't hold a primary. This is the genius plan of Dave Williams, the whack-doodle election denier who has only been Colorado GOP chair since March, but has nearly bankrupted the organization already. Now Williams wants to scrap the primary if Trump is struck from it, and he wants to get permission from the national GOP and work something out for caucuses with the Secretary of State, and Dave only read part of the story, right? The Colorado court ruled the 14th Amendment applies, and because Trump is disqualified from being president or holding any office, he can't be on the Colorado ballot as a presidential candidate or anything else. Doesn't matter how you nominate him, Dave. I guess this would protect Trump from having to see somebody else, quote, win Colorado, unquote. Also, last night, Trump waded into American history, and like anything that is not entirely about him, he made an utter fool out of himself. The last time the Democrats took someone off the ballot was in 1860. They would not allow a man named Abraham Lincoln to be so much as mentioned in the slave states. All right. In 1892, the Republicans in Florida took the incumbent Republican president, Benjamin Harrison, off the ballot because they preferred their own Republican nominee, the populist James B. Weaver. He was the Republican candidate in Florida in 1892. In 1912, the Republicans in California and South Dakota again took their own incumbent Republican president, William Howard Taft, off the ballot so they could make Teddy Roosevelt their official Republican nominee in those states. And the Republicans and the Democrats in Alabama twice kept incumbent presidents off the ballot, Harry Truman in 1948 and Lyndon Johnson in 1964, because both of them tried to end segregation. So if you're going to dive in to who got removed from the ballot by whom, Dementia J, be careful what you wish for, because your comparison may not turn out to be Lincoln. It may turn out to be William Howard Taft. It's oddly apt, isn't it? Trump and William Howard Taft. Now to the lighter side of the news and Adolf Hitler. The Biden campaign has now crossed the Rubicon on this, and I mean in a good way. In an in-your-face graphic with white letters on a red stripe and white letters on a black stripe and 3 pictures of Trump and 2 pictures of Hitler and the heading, "Trump parrots Hitler." and Trump's vermin quote, followed by Hitler's vermin quote, followed by Trump's poisoning the blood quote, followed by Hitler's contamination of the blood quote, followed by Trump's quote that his political opponents are worse than Putin or Kim Jong-un. That is some serious stuff. And also at the top in the text box above that graphic, this is not a coincidence. President Biden himself has not gone that far, but a little over 4 hours later on his personal account, quote, Trump poses many threats to our country, the right to choose, civil rights, voting rights, and America's standing in the world. But the greatest threat he poses is to our democracy. If we lose that, we lose everything. On the Republican side, it's almost as if Nikki Haley actually wanted to say something like that, to slam Trump for the poisoning comment. But she is still the hapless, witless, gutless suck-up she was when she worked for him. She told the Des Moines Register yesterday that Trump's comments were, quote, not constructive and, quote, not necessary and, quote, not helpful, to which I say her comments are, quote, not enough. As to baby Hitler himself, I think he took the night off from campaigning so he could stay in and catch up on his reading. Rise and fall of the Third Reich, maybe? I have to admit something. While putting out the Bulletin and the regular edition Tuesday night, I completely missed two things about his speech in Iowa. One, as the Colorado court was ruling Trump was in Iowa, in Waterloo, Iowa. Coincidence? Less coincidentally, but more ominously, it was already a clear sign of what's left of his sanity barreling down the hill before it utterly jumps the tracks at the curve, that Trump thought denying that he had ever read Mein Kampf was a great flex. But did you hear what he said right after he said he'd never read Mein Kampf? I did not hear it until yesterday.
They're ruining our country, and it's true. They're destroying the blood of our country. That's what they're doing. They're destroying our country. They don't like it when I said that, and I never read Mein Kampf. They said, oh, Hitler said that in a much different way.
They said, oh, Hitler said that in a much different way. Well, if you never read Mein Kampf, how do you know it was in a much different way? Plus, the denial is not just, I didn't read that Hitler book. It's, I didn't read that Hitler book, and sure, I'm saying the same things Hitler did, but in a much different way. See, now this is why sooner or later, every person who succeeds for a time by being unfiltered or telling it like it really is, eventually falls off a cliff. Hitler and I agree, we just say it differently, is not much of a defense. And once again, the last 8 years has taught us that for decades there have lived among us millions of bigots and sadists and masochists who were just pretending not to be any of those things until somebody would come along to liberate them from, self-restraint. But like the dictator for a day thing, Trump is again providing Biden with gold water will drop the bomb on poor little Daisy caliber campaign ads. I mean...
6, 8, 9, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
These are the stakes.
And I never read Mein Kampf. They said, oh, Hitler said that in a much different way.
We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Biden on November 5th. The stakes are too high for you to stay home. Also of interest here, the plaintiffs and the judge were a little worried Rudy Giuliani might not have the $148 million he now owes them on him. So basically, the judge just ordered Rudy to pay up, like tomorrow. And next on that front, Carrie Lake was confident that the defamation case against her was going to be dismissed by the judge. Well, Lake has not won a single court verdict yet, and guess what? She ain't about to start doing so now. That's next. This is Countdown.
This is Countdown with Keith Olbermann.
Still to come on Countdown, of all the people I have kept busy and perhaps driven crazy in my career, the least publicized, the least rewarded have been the poor station and network publicity guys who've had to deal with me over the years. While I understood them and cooperated with them far better than the average broadcaster, I also pulled them out onto the tightrope with me far more often than the average broadcaster. Some were terrible at their jobs. There was one in Los Angeles at KCBS who was best friends with the sportscaster at KNBC and used to feed him stories about me until management caught on to it and fired the whole department. Some at ESPN were really helpful and sympathetic and friendly to this day, and two of them are in the news. Chris LaPlaca just retired as the head of communications since like the day they turned the first shovel of dirt. And he has been succeeded by Josh Krulowitz, who I have been torturing off and on since the early 90s. So I thought this was a good time to mention the day in May 1997 when I finally, irrevocably, and permanently left ESPN and SportsCenter forever, except for when I returned to ESPN Radio in 2005. And then I returned to ESPN2 in 2013. And then I returned to SportsCenter in 2018. Anyway, the story of the exit coming up in Things I Promised Not to Tell. First time for the daily roundup of the miscreants, morons, and Dunning-Kruger effect specimens who constitute today's worst persons in the world. The Bronze, worse, Kellyanne Conway. I think Democrats wake up every morning and they look at the calendar on the iPhone and it says January 6th. The former D-list pundit for when all the smart ones were booked told Fox Noise that date never changes. And when they get into an electric vehicle and go get an abortion. Every day is January 6th, Kellyanne Con job? So you're talking about shelf life and letting go of the past? That would be way less funny if Kellyanne wasn't part of the Christo-fascist attempt to take over the country, which of course has as its roots the life and death of Jesus Christ 2,000 years ago. But we're worried about 3 years ago. Shame on us. Also, I am beginning to become convinced that there is no such person as Kellyanne Conway, that she is a satirical comedy character portrayed by a really dedicated actor, a guy who's really in there on the bit, the way Dame Edna Everage was portrayed by Barry Humphries. Or whoever is doing the Kellyanne Conway character is also portraying the satirical comedy character known as Harris Faulkner. Runner-up, worser, Charlie Kirk, who proves daily that stupidity and poor reading comprehension can be extremely profitable. Liberals hate Christianity so much they want to make it illegal for Chick-fil-A to be closed on Sundays to provide employees a day of rest. I left out paranoia, stupidity and poor reading comprehension, and paranoia. Turns out the story Kirk has warped into some kind of Democrats versus Jesus thing. It's a little different than he posits. Chick-fil-A is bidding for the right to put its restaurants on the rest stops on the New York State Thruway and keep the ones that are already there. And there is a bill in the state legislature that would require all restaurants at all the rest stops on the New York State Thruway to stay open and serve the customers 7 days a week because they all have semi-monopolies. They're the only things you can get on the Thruway. And part of the price they should pay for that is you got to be open when there are travelers. And there are a lot of people who drive on Sunday on the Thruway. Or, as it's known where I grew up, drive on Sunday on the Truway. But the winner, the worst, Kari Lake. Kari Lake is getting Rudied. She slandered Stephen Richer, county recorder of Maricopa, Arizona, Republican, by the way, of course. She slandered him this year, claiming he intentionally printed the wrong image on the ballot on Election Day so that tabulating machines would invalidate those ballots. Obviously, the ballots would have made Kari Lake God, or whatever it is she was running for. Quote, "These guys are really, really terrible at running elections, but I found out they're really good at lying." And then Kari Lake said Richer profited financially by doing this, so he sued her for defamation. She filed a motion to dismiss. The court just denied it. She's going to trial for defamation now. Now, as you may have heard, and Kari may have heard but assumed it was just fake news, a jury awarded Shay Moss and Ruby Freeman $148 million, and yesterday the judge ordered Rudy to pay it now because there is every reason to think he's going to try to avoid paying it ever or to hide assets. Kari, Kari Lake, you're next. Kari, never, ever, ever trust a fired TV newscaster from Phoenix Lake. Today's worst person, including newscasters, in the world! There's a huge oral history of ESPN from 2011 by Jim Miller, and most of it is pretty good, but there's one line in it that triggered this recollection. The executive vice president of the company in 1997 was named Howard Katz, and in this ESPN book, he was quoted as saying, "I didn't fire Keith, I just chose not to renew his contract." And then there's a couple of quotes from guys I never heard of who said, "No, we fired him." None of it's true. Howard and I got along surprisingly well at ESPN, and even better since, so I'm just going to assume he misremembered all of this. And he's right. I mean, legally, he chose not to renew my contract early in 1997, and a couple of weeks later, instead, he offered me a new 4-year contract, which would have basically doubled my salary. And even after I had said no thanks and I signed with NBC, the then president of ABC, Bob Iger, whatever happened to him, tried to get me to back out of the NBC deal, to renege on it, and then sign a new deal at ESPN. So they offered me 2 new deals after they didn't renew my old contract. See how this works? In 96 and 97, it was no secret that my first choice was to leave ESPN. I had come within hours of asking to be let out of my deal in the summer of 1996. A radio station in Chicago, WMVP, had wanted me to go do the afternoon drive show there, a mix of news and sports, and they were offering me twice the money I was getting to host SportsCenter. And I was ready to go. Loved it, had a great week there. They wined me, they dined me, and everybody offered me a free beer. Welcome to Chicago. You're from out of town? And then ownership of the radio station simply pulled the plug on the station. It was in 31st place, and said they could save a lot more money by simply rebroadcasting what was on FM radio. And eventually, and this would have been interesting had I gone to Chicago, eventually the owners sold WMVP to ESPN. Anyway, my ESPN deal was set to expire on December 31st, 1997, but they had the option to extend it for, I can't remember, either for a year after that or 2 years, but they had to notify me really early in 97. And instead, on February 18th, 1997, Howard Katz proposed to my then agent that we tear up the contract and do a new 4-year deal that started at $700,000 a year and covered a radio show with Dan Patrick and the Sunday edition of SportsCenter and the ESPY Awards ceremonies and the internet and everything else. This was a lot of money for ESPN in 1997, $700,000 a year. So we played around with that for a while. But I didn't really want to go into radio full-time, not then, when I still had dark hair. So on April 4th, 1997, Howard Katz came back with another offer, 3 sports centers a week, plus some radio, starting at $550,000 a year. I noticed that this was less than the first offer. So 2 weeks later, at the first ever Jackie Robinson night at Shea Stadium in New York, Howard came up to me and asked me in front of everybody in our booth, ranging from Chris Berman to Robin Roberts to all the producers and briefly to President Bill Clinton. He asked me if we were close on this new deal that he'd offered me. I got angry at him. He got angry at me for getting angry at him. And I said, forget it. And what's more, it makes no sense for me to hang around here as a lame duck, Howard. Wait, Howard the Duck? And he calmed down. He said I could look at other jobs and we'd let things cool off and talk again about a new deal in a few weeks after I looked around to see if it was something I'd rather do than be at ESPN. And if it still wasn't going anywhere, we would agree on a date early in the summer and I could leave 6 months before the contract officially ended. And then 3 huge things happened about this that most people still don't know to this day. Even after all that, when I called Phil Mushnick of the New York Post and Richard Sandomir of the New York Times, and I told them I would be leaving ESPN, and it appeared I would be going to go to Court TV to be the host and executive producer of my own sports show 4 nights a week, I almost stayed at ESPN. Once it got out that I was leaving, I got a letter from a viewer who told me that his son, who had autism, had been at his other son's Little League game. And when his brother banged out a base hit, this kid, who had rarely ever spoken in his life, suddenly shouted out one of my catchphrases. This guy said he hit the ball real hard. Then there was a fly ball, and the boy said, "It's deep and I don't think it's playable." Then they went home, and this virtually non-communicative child began to draw illustrations of my catchphrases. For whatever reason, I had triggered some kind of blossoming by this child, and his brother and his father sent me a book of the child's illustrations of my catchphrases. I am not trying to suggest I really had anything to do with this. It was good fortune and circumstance, and probably something to do with the tone of my voice, nothing more. But I was very moved by this, and I remain so. And by other things, people wrote to me or wrote in the press about how much the show Dan and I did meant to them. And I went back to Howard Katz and I said, look, I know I've been impossible. You have to understand that from my perspective, the company has also been impossible. But Dan and I created too good a show to let it die. When I go here to Court TV, I'm only going to work Monday through Thursday on this new thing. If you will send a car to take me to and from Bristol every Sunday and give me some token salary. Give me $50,000 or something. I'll just do the Sunday night show for you every week. You'll never see me. I'll never see you. It's the show that has the highest factor of management control. It's basically coloring in by numbers. And it reruns all morning on Monday, so 40% of the people who see Dan and I during the week, they see this one show. That's it. If you want some other stuff for me to do, like radio commentaries, great, we can negotiate that. But we should not let this die. At least let's have it on once a week. And Howard Katz said, okay, let me think about this. It sounds really good. And he got back to me the next day and he said it was the most difficult decision he had ever made in this business. But he just couldn't do it. It established too much of a precedent, especially the idea that somebody could work at ESPN and also at some other TV operation. He put it very bluntly. If ESPN was not the sole employer of its people, it could not control them by threatening to fire them. And he looked at me and he said, especially you. And in the same sentence, he said, look, we'd love to continue the relationship, though. We see lots of ways you could fit into ESPN Classic, like once a week or once a month or whatever, and we'd like to get in on the bidding for these radio commentaries that you're going to do on the side. Well, it all ended surprisingly amicably. I decided to go to MSNBC and NBC Sports instead of Court TV, and as I signed the contract, I called the ESPN president, Steve Bornstein, and the head of SportsCenter, John Walsh. I called them from the office of the head of NBC Sports, Dick Ebersol, and in my diary, I can't tell if that was June 19th, 1997 or June 20th, 1997, but I made the calls, and it was Ebersol's idea. Call them now. Call them right now. It'll matter later. The funniest thing was, the following Monday, June 23rd, I was packing up my stuff in my house in Connecticut. I am all set, and I am officially beginning my first week not working for ESPN and instead working for NBC, and the phone rings, and it's John Walsh in Los Angeles for something. and he has to talk to my agent immediately. Do you know where she is right now? Howard Katz and I have just spoken with Bob Iger, and he wants to present a primetime proposal to you for ABC and till you can continue at ESPN. And I laughed, and I said, John, I signed with NBC last week. The World Series and the news show and Super Bowl stuff. Remember, I called you from Dick Ebersol's office. Do you remember? It was Friday or Thursday, whatever it was. We're having the news conference today. And he is dead serious. And he says to me, oh. And there's a long pause. Well, I still need to talk to your agent. Well, I had known Bob Iger, who had apparently precipitated this phone call, since I was in college. In 1979, he had given me an hour of his time just for career advice because I had interned at the TV station for which his first wife had been a news producer, Channel 5 in New York. I told that story, I think, 2 weeks ago. And Bob was wonderful to me. So I called Bob and I explained what had happened, and he said, Steve Bornstein only told me that you were leaving this morning. I'm very, very sorry. I knew there were contentious negotiations about a new deal for you, but I had no clue it was at the point where you might actually leave. I should have known. That's my fault. That's why I told John to make the call he did. Trust me, if I'd known, it would have been totally different. I would have made it right by you. You would have wanted to stay. And if it doesn't work at NBC, you call me directly and I'll bring you back here myself. I mean, the ending was so unexpectedly and surprisingly pleasant that even when my new bosses at MSNBC suddenly announced, I think it was in Newsweek, that they were going to call my program The Big Show, which was our nickname for SportsCenter at ESPN, The Big Show, but they hadn't told anybody at ESPN that we were going to call our MSNBC show The Big Show. It was me who got on the phone with Howard Katz and a couple of other people at ESPN to apologize and to make sure they were okay with it. So even after my ESPN career was officially over and all chance of my returning was dead, we tried to revive it, both of us, Howard Katz and me, in good faith. And I don't think Bob Iger was blowing smoke at me. He had no reason to. And even after all that, the parting was non-nuclear. I think they sent me a fruit basket for my first night at MSNBC on October 1st. And then it all blew up. John Walsh called the TV sports columnist at USA Today, Rudy Martzke, and gave him my first set of ratings from MSNBC just to try to make me look like I couldn't succeed without ESPN. Martzke told me that. Direct quote, "They want to punish you publicly. Walsh has been pressuring me to run the very poor ratings, and he said, I'm going to finally do it. I just wanted to give you a little warning, and maybe you have a comment." Well, that set the tone for the next 5 years of warfare, and it was nuclear pretty quickly. But this impression that ESPN chose to dismiss me or not renew me or not bring me back, it's nonsense. Howard did not renew me. Instead, he offered to double my salary if I stayed. If I had signed with NBC, Iger was still trying to get me to back out after I had signed with NBC and stay at ESPN and ABC. The irony of this minor detail from about 1997, printed in 2011, I think, is that I had already returned to ESPN by the time it was printed. I took an hour out of my day at MSNBC to go on with Dan Patrick on his ESPN radio show from 2005 through 2007. A year after that book came out with that quote in it, 2012, I was talking to the executives at ESPN about going back full-time. And a year later I did, to launch a nightly show on ESPN2. And that ended when they laid off like $100 million worth of talent salaries in 2015. But then I went back again in 2018. And I did SportsCenter, and I did baseball games on radio and on TV, and I did reports, and I did commentaries. I did the not top 10 plays of the week, and on and on and on. And finally, we parted happily in the late summer of 2020 so I could return to political coverage. And I knew they wouldn't want that, and I didn't want to put it on ESPN. And the unlikely result of that, my parting happily in 2020, on the books at Disney, I am listed as a Disney and ESPN retiree. I get benefits. I retired from ESPN. I mean, they didn't give me a gold watch or anything, but I'm technically a retiree. And if you had predicted that in 1997 or 2011, well, you know the cliche. I bring all this up again because I don't know how often I have thought of that father and his 2 boys and the one who started speaking but only in my catchphrases. I would guess it's at least once a month. Those boys would have to be in their 30s by now, or nearly. And I wonder often of what has become of them. And I sure hope they are well. I've done all the damage I can do here. Thank you for listening. Countdown has come to you from the Vin Scully Studios at the Olbermann Broadcasting Empire in New York. Countdown musical directors Brian Ray and John Philip Chanel arranged, produced, and performed most of our music. Mr. Ray was on the guitars, bass, and drums, and Mr. Chanel handled orchestration and keyboards. Produced by TKO Brothers. Other music, including some of the Beethoven compositions, were arranged and performed by the group No Horns Allowed. Sports music is the Olbermann theme from ESPN2, written by Mitch Warren Davis, courtesy of ESPN Inc. Our satirical and pithy musical comments are by Nancy Faust, the best baseball stadium organist ever. Our announcer today was my friend Jonathan Banks from Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, and everything else was pretty much my fault. So that's Countdown for this, the 1080th day since Dementia J. Trump's first attempted coup against the democratically elected government of the United States. Use the Insurrection Act against him and them and the 14th Amendment and convict him while we still can. The next scheduled countdown is tomorrow. Bulletins as the news warrants. Till then, I'm Keith Olbermann. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, and good luck.